All right, so yesterday we talked about the first couple of things that are important in this unit. So we're really focusing on, for both photosynthesis and cellular respiration, how am I getting energy? Where is all of the energy coming from? And what chemical processes are happening? And what we're going to see, especially in today's lesson, is that there are a lot of things that happen in both, that happen in photosynthesis and in cell respiration, but sometimes they happen in the opposite order, or the other way around, since we know one of them is there sort of to absorb energy, the other one is there to produce energy. So yesterday, we mentioned in our class specifically our chloroplast and mitochondrion and the pieces that made up the chloroplast and mitochondrion. And so it's important that you know, for example, if I said the stroma, which part of the chloroplast I'm talking about. Same thing for the mitochondrion. It would be important that you knew, for example, if I said the cristae, you knew which part that was. I will ask you to recognize them on a picture. And so that's why it's important that you can recognize them on a picture. Now that we had done yesterday, and then we started talking about the overview, and I want to remind you just a couple of things that we had already said. Photosynthesis happens in plants, or more specifically, autotrophs. Auto means on your own, troph refers to how you get your food. So an autotroph makes its own food. Now plants and animals, which we could call heterotrophs, both perform cellular respiration. So I mentioned yesterday the picture was very specifically a cow and some grass, so that there was a plant and an animal on that side. The other thing I want to remind you of is this idea. Photosynthesis, at least one part of it, has to happen during the day because solar energy is required. Cellular respiration happens anytime. Now the last thing I want to just remind you of in general, anything that is alive realistically performs cellular respiration. We have a tendency to focus on plants and animals because they're the ones that we discuss the most, but don't forget there are other categories of living things, bacteria, mushrooms, those are all living things and they all perform some type of cellular respiration. The type that we'll discuss the most is the type that happens in a eukaryotic animal cell, one that has a mitochondria. Now we're going to focus today on what goes in between all of these arrows, because I want you to recognize that the same substances are involved in photosynthesis and cell respiration, but in different capacities. So these first two arrows, here and here, are trying to illustrate what it is that I am getting from photosynthesis that I'm going to use in cellular respiration. So we're going to start a cycle. The two substances that belong here are oxygen, which I could easily represent as O2 gas, and glucose, whose formula is C6H12O6 solid. It would be realistic for me to represent these substances with their chemical formula or with the word that represents them. Both of them would be allowed. So it's important that you recognize the formulas for them. Now you'll notice over here on this side, there's another arrow kind of going off to the side. And one of the things that you might recall learning in Science 10 or perhaps some other chemistry class or science class is that any time a chemical reaction happens or any time energy changes form, there is always some energy that is, sometimes we say lost, which isn't really the best word, but energy that is wasted in the form of heat. So any time energy changes from one form to another, heat is produced. In this case, heat is produced because I'm taking solar energy and I'm changing it to chemical energy. So because I'm doing an energy conversion, there's going to be some heat produced. This is the second law of thermodynamics. We'll pause for a second. All right. So as solar energy is absorbed by a chloroplast and converted into chemical energy, there is some heat that is produced. Now the same two substances that photosynthesis produces, cellular respiration is going to use. So that's why the arrows show them going right back in here to the mitochondrion. Now there are a couple of arrows sticking out in a couple of different directions here so that I could illustrate a few points. Point number one, just like in photosynthesis, when cellular respiration happens, because I'm converting energy, there is always going to be some heat produced. The second thing that I'm going to specifically write here is this abbreviation ATP. And I'm writing it here instead of in the arrow that goes back to photosynthesis because ATP is an energy molecule, and generally photosynthesis is not going to use the energy that cell respiration produced. Rather, it's going to use the energy that came from the sun. We'll talk on the next couple of slides about what ATP is and what it stands for and what it's for, but ATP is a molecule that provides energy. The other two substances over here are carbon dioxide, which most people are familiar with. It's CO2 gas, and water, H2O liquid. Now I just want to point out the fact that water is liquid here. Your body and plants generally are not hotter than 100 degrees Celsius. If they were, they would probably be dead. So anytime we're talking about biological processes, water needs to be in liquid format. It's a fairly common mistake, especially if you take chem later on and they ask you about this all the time, for people to think that water is a gas, because water is often a gas in other chemical reactions. So I just really want to point that out specifically. Your body is 37 degrees. At 37 degrees, water is a liquid, not a gas. So this is the overview. This is generally what is happening during photosynthesis and cell respiration. I would ask you questions about this basic idea. Usually they would end up being multiple choice questions. But a question I like to ask, and you'll see it's in your textbook in a little bit, is to trace the path of energy. Usually from the sun to something that's using energy later on. And so this little diagram could help you follow where the sun's energy is going. Over here, I converted solar energy to chemical energy. So I would follow it. I make glucose and I make oxygen in my chloroplast. Some organism eats some glucose and breathes some oxygen in, and then their mitochondrion makes some ATP. That's how energy from the sun ends up being energy that you can use to perform life processes. So that idea, tracing the path of energy, is a very common one for me to ask, and it's not so easy to ask that in a multiple choice question. First, we're going to talk about what is ATP. So ATP is an abbreviation. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. So I'm going to highlight the T part. Adenosine is sort of the background of the molecule. Adenosine is sort of the sugar protein compound that's in the background of the molecule. And we're not really going to focus on that part of the molecule. We're going to focus on this part, tri, which means 3, and this part, phosphate. So ATP is a molecule that's made of 3 phosphate groups, which is really our focus. It's also made of ribose and adenine, together known as adenosine. And it has very high energy bonds. These high energy bonds are between the phosphate groups. And so that's why we're focusing on them. These high energy bonds, when I break them, can provide energy for a number of different things. So some of them are fairly obvious. They provide energy for muscle contraction. So anytime any one of your muscles contracts, ATP is required. Now, if you were to move, let's say your arm in the direction of a bicep curl, you are not using one muscle cell. You are using a ton of muscle cells. You'll read in your textbook a little bit later on when we get there, or maybe you read it yesterday because you actually read the figures and the side notes. You use somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 kilograms of ATP per day, so you have to constantly be synthesizing it. If you think about where muscles are in your body, and some of you might need to just take a moment and stop, every single movement that happens in your body is because a muscle is doing it. So right now, the fact that my eyes are blinking, I'm speaking, I'm breathing, my heart is beating, my arteries have muscles and my veins have muscles in them helping blood to flow, and that's all automatic things that I'm not really even in control of. I'm moving my hands, I'm stepping back and forth because I have trouble staying still. I'm using a ton of muscles all the time. Even you, who are mostly just sitting there, you're using muscles. Someone's chewing gum. You are using ATP to think, that's for darn sure. But you need energy for a lot of things. Cellular division could be represented by one of these two words, mitosis or meiosis. You might recall hearing about them sometime in the past, maybe grade 9 science. Those are two ways that your cells can make copies of themselves. Mitosis is the way that your body cells do that. Meiosis is really reserved for reproductive cells. Now, a flagella, if I had to give you something to imagine, if you imagine what a sperm cell looks like, how it has a little tail, that's what a flagella is. There are lots of types of cells that have some sort of tail-like structure that helps with motion. Now, cilia are like little hairs on the outside of a cell. Cilia would be found in a lot of places. You have little cilia cells in, for example, your respiratory system. They help clean the air, but they could also be found on the outside of microorganisms that use them for locomotion. Now here's a big one that we already know about. If I'm going to make a macromolecule, I need energy to do that. And so generally, chemical reactions require energy. That is a generalization that you can make. Another thing, activating or inactivating a protein, or we could even say an enzyme, because that's the function of proteins that we focused on the most, those all require energy. So it's quite common to refer to ATP as molecular currency. It's like money your cells use to purchase things like being able to move and acquiring food and removing waste. Now, these are not the only things in the universe that ATP is used for. This is just a selection. Something else that I'm going to mention and maybe add to this list, because we'll talk about it in a little while later on. I'd like to mention active transport. Now, for those of you who just did Science 10 last semester, this might be fresher in your memories. Active transport is a way to make molecule concentration be higher on one side than on the other. So it's used to make molecules collect in one spot rather than spread out evenly, which is what diffusion would do. Now over here on the right, you have a picture of this, and I just want to highlight the part that has the phosphate groups down here at the bottom. There's 1, there's 2, there's 3. I could realistically show you pictures and ask you questions based on how many phosphate groups there are. And so when there are 3 phosphate groups, I have ATP. But it's possible to have less than 3 phosphate groups if I'm going to use one of them to provide energy. So down here on the bottom, I have a little diagram that shows ATP at the top. So you'll see there's 3 phosphate groups, 3 Ps, and then to make things simpler, ribose and adenine are just shown as shapes. Ribose is a pentagon and adenine is sort of like 2 diamonds put together. And that's because we're really not focusing on their structure, we're focusing on those phosphate groups. When we switch from ATP to something called ADP, energy becomes available for cellular work and for chemical synthesis. So when ATP loses that 3rd phosphate group, energy becomes available. ADP stands for adenosine diphosphate. It means that there are 2 phosphate groups instead of 3. Now there's also something called AMP, adenosine monophosphate, but it's not something that we're going to discuss, but I just want you to know that that's a possibility as well. Now when energy from sunlight, in the case of photosynthesis, or energy from food, in the case of cell respiration, when there is an energy input, we can take ADP and turn it back into ATP. So it is a cycle. I can always make more ATP by reattaching a phosphate group to it. So we know what's happening overall. We know what ATP is. We still need to discuss the types of reactions that happen during photosynthesis and cell respiration so that it's possible for us to even make ATP or possible for us to use ADP. So the first thing that we'll talk about is something called chemiosmosis. And if we look at the word, it has 2 parts, the chemi part and the osmosis part. Now, osmosis, some of you might be familiar with. Osmosis is the passive movement of water so that its concentration is equal on both sides of a membrane or in the entire space that it's in. Chemiosmosis is us inferring that there's some other substance, some other chemical that's doing this process besides water. So during chemiosmosis, here's what's going to happen. I'm going to situate you in this picture. This picture is showing me, first of all, a thylakoid membrane. Now, a membrane is always made up of a phospholipid bilayer. And so what you see here is the phospholipid bilayer. The phospho part are the yellow circles on the outside. The lipids are the little tails. And it's called a bilayer because, quite obviously, there are 2 layers. So that's the structure of a cell membrane, which should be something that you have at least heard of before. Very technically, this is a thylakoid membrane. That means that we are inside of a chloroplast. So that means that out here is the stroma. So that's what we're looking at. We're looking at a really magnified view of one thylakoid membrane, and the space around it would be the stroma. So if I was to show you sort of where this picture came from, here's a chloroplast, here's a little thylakoid, and it's like we've blown that up so that we could look inside of it. Now we're going to talk about the things that are happening in this picture as we go along. But it's really tough to talk about chemiosmosis without talking about where things come from. In this particular definition, this is what interests us, this structure down here at the bottom. That structure at the bottom is called ATP synthase. So if I look at the name of that structure, it's telling me this thing synthesizes ATP. That's exactly what its name refers to. So it is a special structure, like it says, that is in the thylakoid membrane. And you can see it spans across the whole thylakoid. Now the key thing is that it provides the only pathway for hydrogen ions to move down their concentration gradient. This means that there is a high concentration of hydrogen ions inside the thylakoid. And the idea with osmosis is that molecules are trying to spread out. So these hydrogen ions want to get out of the thylakoid. They want to go out into the stroma so that concentration is more equalized. But since hydrogen ions have a charge, that's what an ion is. It is a charged particle. Ions have a difficult time simply going directly through the cell membrane, and most charged particles do. So they have to go through a protein or a structure. ATP synthase is that structure. So they're going to move down their concentration gradient. What that means is that they're going to move outside the thylakoid to a spot where concentration was lower. Now the way that this does something useful is that as this happens, it's linked to mechanisms that bond a free phosphate to ADP. So how does ATP actually get formed? Technically, hydrogen ions move through ATP synthase, and their movement activates a mechanism, and then a phosphate group is linked to ADP. So then I'm going to point out something that's really important. This same process happens in cell respiration. ATP synthase is there. Obviously, it's not going to happen on a thylakoid membrane in cell respiration. In cell respiration, we're inside of a mitochondrion, and the name of the membrane is the cristae. And so that's the membrane that we'll be focusing on. But this same process happens during photosynthesis and cell respiration. And that's a really key point. So what we need to talk about next is an idea of what type of chemical reaction is happening. And so we're going to talk about oxidation and reduction reactions. Now, oxidation, really generally, if we were to talk about chemical reactions overall, oxidation is the removal or the loss of electrons. Now, in our particular case, we're going to be talking about things that are attached to hydrogen. And so we're going to focus on hydrogen. But in general, losing something is oxidation. Gaining something is reduction. Now again, because we're focusing on some pretty specific reactions, we're going to focus on the gain of electrons on hydrogen, not just on any atom in general. But so that you can remember what oxidation and what reduction is, there are a couple of little mnemonics. This one is my favorite one. I remember learning this in high school. The mnemonic is Leo the lion says grr. L-E-O represents loss of electrons is oxidation. GER, which is probably not how you would spell GER normally, it's kind of a ridiculous way to spell it, stands for gain of electrons is reduction. Now there's another mnemonic that I've seen used quite frequently, especially here. The other mnemonic is oil rig. That stands for oxidation is loss, reduction is gain. Now the reason I think that you need a mnemonic is because the word reduction doesn't sound on the surface like I'm getting something. It sounds like I'm losing something, and in fact it's quite the opposite. So the first thing I need you to recognize is that gaining something, reduction. Losing something, oxidation. And for us, for the molecules that we're going to discuss, hydrogen is going to be involved. Now we are going to use molecules called coenzymes. Now we know what these are. Coenzymes help enzymes perform their function. But these coenzymes are going to be the transport for electrons and hydrogen ions. Basically what's going to happen is that we're constantly going to be taking hydrogen away from something and giving it to something else. And so there needs to be a way to transport these hydrogen ions around, and coenzymes are going to accomplish that. Here are our coenzymes that we're going to talk about. You'll notice that first I wrote the oxidized form. Oxidized means they already lost a hydrogen. Now there's two coenzymes that are very similar. They differ only by a letter. So you'll notice that I wrote it in brackets. One of them is called NAD, or nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide. You don't have to use that whole name. You can just call it NAD. The other one is called NADP, and that P, if I were to add it, means phosphate. Now you'll notice that the oxidized forms have a plus, and that's not me making a typo, that is purposeful. That's because if I take away an electron, I should have a positive charge. You guys might remember learning in Science 10, when you lose an electron, now you have more protons than electrons. So losing an electron gives you a positive charge. The other one is called FAD, and again, the positive is on purpose. It's flavin adenine dinucleotide. Again, you can just use the abbreviation. That's what most people do. Now, if those molecules pick up a hydrogen and become reduced, this is how we would write them. NADPH, NADH, or FADH2, and that's on purpose, it's not a typo. FAD needs to collect 2 hydrogen atoms. Now when you have the reduced forms, you'll notice I put in brackets, these have reducing power. That means they could give an H to another molecule. In other words, they could cause another molecule to become reduced by giving away their hydrogen. Now, because we're constantly going back and forth between things that have hydrogen attached to them and things that don't, we need to realize that these two processes go together. If something gets oxidized, something else has to be reduced. If something is reduced, something else has to be oxidized. The first law of thermodynamics says I can't get something from nothing. I can only get energy from where it already existed. And the same is true for atoms. I can't get them from nowhere. So if I'm going to gain hydrogen, something else has to lose it. Now this picture up here is illustrating that very idea. Here are two molecules. You'll notice the top one has electrons and the bottom one doesn't. And as they meet each other, the top one loses its electrons and the bottom one gains electrons. These processes have to happen together. You can't oxidize something without reducing something else.